Question 1. Stakeholder feedback indicates that the current hiring assessment for Barrett Business Services may be perceived as unfair by some candidates, potentially impacting the quality of applicants and the company's reputation. Which of the following represents the most appropriate initial response to this feedback? Option A. Immediately discontinue the use of the current assessment and revert to a previous, less sophisticated method of candidate evaluation. Option B. Initiate a comprehensive review of the assessment's design, content, and administration to identify any potential biases or areas for improvement, consulting relevant HR best practices and legal guidelines. Option C. Inform stakeholders that the assessment is legally compliant and therefore no changes are necessary, as candidate perception is subjective. Option D. Implement minor cosmetic changes to the assessment's presentation to address the feedback, without altering its core structure or content. Correct answer is B. Initiate a comprehensive review of the assessment's design, content, and administration to identify any potential biases or areas for improvement, consulting relevant HR best practices and legal guidelines. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing competing stakeholder interests and adhering to regulatory obligations within the context of a hiring assessment. The feedback highlights a potential disconnect between the assessment's perceived fairness and its actual effectiveness in identifying suitable candidates. Navigating this requires careful judgment to ensure the assessment process is both legally compliant and ethically sound, while also meeting the business's need for qualified employees. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic review of the assessment's design and implementation, focusing on objective criteria and potential biases. This aligns with best professional practices in human resources and aligns with the spirit of regulations that aim to prevent discrimination and ensure fair employment opportunities. By seeking to understand the root cause of the feedback and considering evidence-based improvements, the approach demonstrates a commitment to fairness and compliance. This proactive stance is crucial for maintaining the integrity of the hiring process and mitigating legal risks. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach would be to dismiss the feedback outright without investigation. This fails to acknowledge the potential for systemic issues within the assessment and could lead to continued unfairness, potentially violating equal opportunity employment laws. It also demonstrates a lack of responsiveness to stakeholder concerns, which is ethically problematic. Another incorrect approach would be to make superficial changes to the assessment without understanding the underlying issues. This might involve minor tweaks to wording or format, but would not address any fundamental biases or ineffectiveness. Such an approach is unlikely to satisfy stakeholders or improve the assessment's validity, and could be seen as a token effort that fails to meet regulatory expectations for a fair and effective process. A third incorrect approach would be to focus solely on the immediate business need for hires, potentially overlooking the assessment's fairness. This could lead to prioritizing speed over due diligence, increasing the risk of discriminatory hiring practices and legal challenges. It prioritizes short-term gains over long-term compliance and ethical responsibility. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework when faced with stakeholder feedback regarding hiring assessments. This framework typically involves 1. Acknowledging and documenting the feedback. 2. Investigating the feedback objectively, gathering data and evidence. 3. Analyzing the assessment's design and implementation against relevant legal and ethical standards. 4. Identifying potential biases or areas for improvement. 5. Developing and implementing evidence-based solutions. 6. Communicating changes and outcomes to stakeholders. This systematic process ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and aligned with professional best practices and regulatory requirements. Question 2. The evaluation methodology shows that a client has expressed a strong desire to invest in a particular high-risk, speculative stock, citing a friend's anecdotal success. The advisor has reviewed the client's financial profile and determined that this investment is not suitable given the client's moderate risk tolerance and short-term savings goals. What is the most appropriate course of action for the advisor? Option A. Explain to the client why the recommended stock is not suitable based on their financial profile and objectives, and present alternative investments that align with their risk tolerance and goals. Option B. Recommend the speculative stock, but advise the client to invest only a very small portion of their portfolio, hoping to satisfy their request while minimizing potential losses. Option C. Proceed with the investment in the speculative stock as requested by the client, as their explicit instruction overrides the advisor's suitability assessment. Option D. Inform the client that the advisor cannot fulfill their request and suggest they seek advice from another professional, who may be willing to execute the trade. The correct answer is A. Explain to the client why the recommended stock is not suitable based on their financial profile and objectives, and present alternative investments that align with their risk tolerance and goals. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire for a specific outcome and the advisor's obligation to provide objective, compliant advice. The advisor must navigate the client's expectations while adhering strictly to the regulatory framework governing financial advice, specifically the principles of suitability and client best interest. The core of the challenge lies in balancing client satisfaction with regulatory adherence. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the client's financial well-being and regulatory compliance above all else. By thoroughly assessing the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and objectives, and then recommending products that genuinely align with these factors, the advisor upholds their fiduciary duty. This aligns with the principles of providing advice that is in the client's best interest, a cornerstone of regulatory frameworks designed to protect consumers. Transparency about the limitations and risks of any proposed investment is also crucial, ensuring the client can make an informed decision. An incorrect approach that involves recommending a product solely based on the client's stated preference, without a thorough suitability assessment, constitutes a regulatory failure. This violates the principle of acting in the client's best interest and could lead to unsuitable investments, potentially causing financial harm to the client. Ethically, it prioritizes expediency or client appeasement over professional responsibility. Another incorrect approach, such as exaggerating the potential returns or downplaying the risks of a product to secure the client's business, is a clear breach of ethical conduct and regulatory requirements regarding fair and balanced representation of investment products. This misrepresentation erodes trust and can lead to significant client losses, resulting in regulatory sanctions. The professional decision-making process for similar situations involves a structured approach. First, fully understand the client's stated needs and desires. Second, conduct a comprehensive assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, investment objectives, and time horizon. Third, identify suitable investment options that align with this assessment, considering all relevant regulatory requirements and product characteristics. Fourth, clearly communicate the rationale for recommendations, including potential risks and benefits, to the client, ensuring they understand the implications. Finally, document the entire process, including client discussions and the basis for recommendations, to demonstrate compliance and professional diligence. Question 3. System analysis indicates that a client is requesting a specific course of action that appears to conflict with the established regulatory guidelines governing business services. The client is insistent on proceeding with their preferred method, expressing frustration with potential delays or alternative suggestions. As a professional advisor, what is the most appropriate immediate response to this situation? Option A. Clearly explain the regulatory implications and potential consequences of the client's requested action, while also exploring compliant alternatives that might achieve their underlying objectives. Option B. Politely but firmly refuse to discuss the matter further, stating that the firm cannot accommodate requests that deviate from standard procedures. Option C. Suggest a method that technically bypasses the regulation, but still delivers the outcome the client desires, framing it as a creative solution. Option D. Immediately implement the client's requested action to maintain client satisfaction and avoid further conflict, assuming the client understands any potential risks. Correct answer is A. Clearly explain the regulatory implications and potential consequences of the client's requested action, while also exploring compliant alternatives that might achieve their underlying objectives. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's immediate desire for a specific outcome and the advisor's duty to provide objective, compliant advice. The advisor must navigate the client's emotional state and potential pressure while upholding regulatory standards and ethical obligations. The challenge lies in balancing client relationship management with the non-negotiable requirements of the regulatory framework. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates adherence to the Barrett Business Services hiring assessment tests implied regulatory framework, which prioritizes client best interests within legal and ethical boundaries. By explaining the regulatory implications and potential consequences of the client's request, the advisor acts as a fiduciary, providing informed guidance. This aligns with principles of transparency, honesty, and competence, ensuring the client understands the risks and legal ramifications, thereby enabling a truly informed decision. This approach upholds the advisor's professional integrity and the firm's reputation. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately acceding to the client's request without further discussion. This fails to meet the advisor's duty of care and could lead to regulatory breaches if the requested action is non-compliant. It prioritizes client satisfaction over regulatory adherence and ethical responsibility, potentially exposing both the client and the firm to significant penalties. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's request outright without attempting to understand their underlying needs or explaining the regulatory constraints. This demonstrates a lack of empathy and poor client relationship management, potentially alienating the client and failing to explore alternative, compliant solutions that might still meet the client's objectives. It also misses an opportunity to educate the client on regulatory requirements. A third incorrect approach is to suggest a workaround that technically circumvents the regulation, but achieves the client's desired outcome. This is ethically unsound and likely constitutes a violation of regulatory principles, as it undermines the spirit and intent of the law. Such actions can lead to severe disciplinary measures, fines, and reputational damage. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's request and underlying needs. This is followed by a thorough assessment of the request against the relevant regulatory framework and internal policies. If the request is non-compliant, the professional should clearly explain the regulatory barriers and potential consequences to the client. The next step involves exploring alternative compliance solutions that address the client's objectives. Throughout this process, maintaining open communication, transparency, and a commitment to ethical conduct is paramount. Question 4. Assessment of the most appropriate decision-making process when faced with a complex operational issue that has potential regulatory implications and requires a prompt response. Option A. Rely on the judgment of the most senior person present, assuming their experience will lead to the best outcome without further investigation. Option B. Delay any decision until all potential risks and benefits can be exhaustively quantified, even if this means missing a critical deadline. Option C. Immediately implement the solution that appears to address the core problem most directly, based on initial observations and common industry practices. Option D. Conduct a thorough review of all relevant internal policies, external regulations, and potential stakeholder impacts, consulting with legal and compliance departments before proposing any course of action. The correct answer is C. Immediately implement the solution that appears to address the core problem most directly, based on initial observations and common industry practices. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing competing priorities, the immediate need for a decision versus the imperative to gather sufficient information to make a sound, compliant, and ethical choice. The pressure to act quickly can lead to overlooking critical details or potential consequences, which could result in regulatory breaches or ethical lapses. The complexity arises from the need to apply a structured decision-making framework under time constraints. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic, multi-stage process that prioritizes information gathering, stakeholder consultation, and risk assessment before committing to a course of action. This aligns with best professional practices by ensuring that decisions are informed, justifiable, and compliant with relevant regulations and ethical standards. Specifically, it emphasizes understanding the full scope of the issue, identifying potential impacts, and exploring all viable options, thereby mitigating the risk of unintended negative consequences. This methodical approach is crucial for maintaining professional integrity and adhering to the principles of responsible business conduct expected by regulatory bodies and stakeholders. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves making a decision based solely on the most readily available information or the quickest solution. This fails to meet the standard of due diligence required by professional conduct guidelines. It risks overlooking critical regulatory requirements or ethical considerations, potentially leading to non-compliance, reputational damage, and financial penalties. Such an approach demonstrates a lack of thoroughness and a disregard for the potential ramifications of a hasty decision. Another incorrect approach is to defer the decision entirely without establishing a clear process for resolution or seeking appropriate guidance. While caution is important, indefinite delay without a plan can be as detrimental as a hasty decision. It can lead to missed opportunities, continued operational inefficiencies, and a perception of indecisiveness, which can erode trust among stakeholders and potentially violate implicit or explicit service level agreements or regulatory expectations for timely action. A third incorrect approach is to make a decision based on personal bias or the perceived preferences of a dominant stakeholder, without objective analysis or consideration of broader implications. This violates ethical principles of fairness and impartiality. It can lead to decisions that are not in the best interest of the business or its clients, and may also contravene regulations designed to ensure fair dealing and prevent conflicts of interest. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that includes 1. Clearly defining the problem and its scope. 2. Gathering all relevant information, including regulatory requirements and potential impacts. 3. Identifying and evaluating all possible courses of action. 4. Consulting with relevant stakeholders and seeking expert advice where necessary. 5. Assessing the risks and benefits of each option. 6. Selecting the option that best aligns with regulatory compliance, ethical principles, and business objectives. And 7. Documenting the decision-making process and the rationale for the chosen course of action. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are well-reasoned, defensible, and uphold professional standards. Question 5. Comparative studies suggest that effective decision-making in dynamic business environments often hinges on a structured approach. Imagine you are presented with a complex operational issue that requires an immediate response to avoid significant disruption. Which of the following approaches best aligns with professional best practices and regulatory expectations for responsible decision-making? Option A. Rely on past similar experiences and make a decision based on what has worked before, assuming the current situation is identical. Option B. Prioritize speed above all else, implementing the first plausible solution that comes to mind without thoroughly evaluating its potential consequences. Option C. Conduct a rapid assessment of the immediate situation, gather essential factual information, identify potential immediate impacts, and then formulate a decision based on this concise understanding, documenting the rationale. Option D. Immediately escalate the issue to senior management without conducting any initial analysis, deferring the decision entirely. The correct answer is C. Conduct a rapid assessment of the immediate situation, gather essential factual information, identify potential immediate impacts, and then formulate a decision based on this concise understanding, documenting the rationale. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing competing priorities, the immediate need for a decision versus the thoroughness of information gathering, all within the context of regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. The pressure to act quickly can lead to overlooking critical details or making assumptions that could have significant consequences. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any decision made is not only timely, but also informed, defensible, and aligned with professional standards. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, evidence-based decision-making process that is inherently compliant with regulatory expectations for due diligence and responsible action. This approach emphasizes gathering sufficient relevant information, considering potential impacts, and documenting the rationale, which are all fundamental tenets of regulatory frameworks governing business operations and professional conduct. It demonstrates a commitment to acting with integrity and prudence, minimizing risk, and ensuring accountability. An incorrect approach that relies solely on intuition or past experience without current verification fails to meet the standard of due diligence. This can lead to regulatory breaches if the assumptions made are no longer valid or if the situation has unique characteristics not covered by prior experience. Ethically, It is a failure to act with the care and diligence expected of a professional. Another incorrect approach that involves seeking external validation without first conducting an internal assessment is inefficient and potentially exposes confidential information unnecessarily. While collaboration is valuable, it should follow a foundational understanding of the situation. This approach can also be seen as a deferral of responsibility, which is ethically problematic. A third incorrect approach that focuses on the quickest solution without considering long-term implications or potential risks is professionally negligent. This can result in decisions that are expedient in the short term but create greater problems or liabilities down the line, violating the principle of acting in the best interest of the organization and its stakeholders. The professional reasoning framework that should be used in similar situations involves a systematic process. First, clearly define the problem and the decision needed. Second, gather all relevant information, considering its reliability and completeness. Third, identify and evaluate alternative courses of action, weighing their potential benefits and drawbacks. Fourth, consult relevant policies, regulations, and ethical guidelines. Fifth, make a reasoned decision based on the gathered information and analysis. Finally, document the decision-making process and the rationale behind the chosen course of action. This structured approach ensures that decisions are well considered, defensible, and aligned with professional and regulatory standards. Question 6. The assessment process reveals that Barrett Business Services is considering a new operational expansion that involves increased resource consumption and potential waste generation. While the projected financial benefits are significant, there are concerns about the potential environmental footprint of this expansion. Which of the following actions best demonstrates a responsible and compliant approach to managing these potential environmental impacts? Option A. Rely on informal discussions with long-term employees to gauge the likely environmental effects of the expansion. Option B. Proceed with the expansion, assuming that existing general environmental permits are sufficient to cover any new impacts. Option C. Undertake a formal environmental impact assessment, IA, to identify, predict, and evaluate the potential environmental consequences of the proposed expansion, and develop mitigation strategies accordingly. Option D. Conduct a brief internal review, focusing only on the most obvious and immediate potential environmental issues. The correct answer is C. Undertake a formal environmental impact assessment, IA, to identify, predict, and evaluate the potential environmental consequences of the proposed expansion, and develop mitigation strategies accordingly. Explanation. The assessment process reveals a scenario where a new business initiative, while promising financial growth, carries potential environmental risks. The professional challenge lies in balancing the pursuit of business objectives with the imperative to operate responsibly and sustainably, adhering to all relevant environmental regulations. This requires a proactive and thorough approach to identifying, evaluating, and mitigating potential negative impacts before they materialize. The correct approach involves conducting a comprehensive environmental impact assessment, IA. This process is mandated by various environmental protection laws and regulations, which require businesses to systematically identify and assess the potential environmental consequences of their proposed activities. A robust EIA ensures that all stakeholders are informed, that potential harm is minimized through mitigation strategies, and that the business operates within legal and ethical boundaries. This aligns with the principle of environmental stewardship and demonstrates a commitment to corporate social responsibility, which is increasingly expected by regulators and the public. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the initiative without a formal EIA, assuming that existing general environmental permits are sufficient. This fails to acknowledge the specific and potentially novel risks associated with the new venture. Such an oversight could lead to regulatory noncompliance, resulting in fines, legal action, and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach is to conduct a superficial review, focusing only on obvious, immediate impacts while ignoring cumulative or long-term effects. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the precautionary principle, which is a cornerstone of environmental law. Finally, relying solely on anecdotal evidence or the opinions of individuals without relevant expertise to gauge environmental risk is professionally negligent and ethically unsound, as it bypasses established scientific and regulatory methodologies. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. identifying all applicable environmental laws and regulations. 2. Proactively assessing potential impacts through established methodologies like EIAs. 3. Engaging with environmental experts and regulatory bodies. 4. Developing and implementing robust mitigation plans. 5. Continuously monitoring and reviewing environmental performance. This systematic approach ensures that business decisions are informed by a thorough understanding of environmental responsibilities. Question 7. To address the challenge of implementing a new customer relationship management (CRM) system that will significantly alter sales and customer service workflows, which approach to impact assessment would best ensure a smooth transition and mitigate potential disruptions? Option A. Rely on informal discussions with a few long-term employees to gauge potential impacts and make necessary adjustments based on their opinions. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive assessment involving all affected departments, mapping current processes, identifying potential changes to roles and responsibilities, forecasting impacts on data management and reporting, and engaging key stakeholders for feedback. Option C. Prioritize the assessment on the financial benefits and cost savings associated with the new CRM, with a brief review of technical integration requirements. Option D. Focus the assessment primarily on the IT department's technical capabilities to implement the system, assuming other departments will adapt as needed. The correct answer is B. Conduct a comprehensive assessment involving all affected departments, mapping current processes, identifying potential changes to roles and responsibilities, forecasting impacts on data management and reporting, and engaging key stakeholders for feedback. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in business operations: the need to assess the impact of a significant change on existing processes and stakeholders. This requires a structured and thorough approach to identify potential risks, benefits, and necessary adjustments. The professional challenge lies in ensuring that the assessment is comprehensive, objective, and aligns with the company's strategic goals and regulatory obligations. Careful judgment is required to balance the immediate needs of the project with the long-term implications for the business and its employees. The correct approach involves a systematic evaluation of all relevant factors. This includes identifying all affected departments, understanding the scope of the proposed changes, and forecasting potential consequences across various operational areas. It also necessitates engaging with key stakeholders to gather diverse perspectives and ensure buy-in. This comprehensive method aligns with best professional practices by promoting informed decision-making, proactive risk mitigation, and efficient resource allocation. From a regulatory and ethical standpoint, a thorough impact assessment helps ensure compliance with any applicable employment laws, data privacy regulations, or industry-specific guidelines by anticipating and addressing potential issues before they arise. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the immediate cost savings of the change overlooks potential negative impacts on employee morale, productivity, and customer service. This failure to consider broader consequences can lead to unforeseen operational disruptions and reputational damage, potentially violating ethical obligations to employees and customers. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over thoroughness by skipping stakeholder consultations risks alienating key personnel and missing critical insights. This can result in the implementation of a flawed strategy, leading to inefficiencies and non-compliance with internal policies or external regulations. A third incorrect approach that relies on anecdotal evidence rather than data-driven analysis lacks objectivity and can lead to biased conclusions. This can result in poor strategic decisions that do not accurately reflect the true impact of the change, potentially leading to regulatory scrutiny if the decisions result in non-compliance. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with clearly defining the scope and objectives of the impact assessment. This should be followed by identifying all potential areas of impact, gathering relevant data from reliable sources, and consulting with all affected stakeholders. The analysis should then focus on evaluating the identified impacts, prioritizing risks and opportunities, and developing mitigation strategies. Finally, the findings should be documented and communicated to relevant parties to support informed decision-making and effective implementation. Question 8. Stakeholder feedback indicates a key client is requesting a new, specialized service that Barrett Business Services does not currently offer. The sales team is eager to secure this business, but there are concerns about the operational capacity and potential compliance implications of introducing this service rapidly. What is the most appropriate initial step for Barrett Business Services to take in response to this client request? Option A. Proceed with offering the service based on the sales team's understanding of the client's needs, assuming existing operational structures can accommodate it. Option B. Immediately inform the client that the service can be provided, and then work backward to figure out the operational and compliance details. Option C. Delegate the responsibility of developing and implementing the new service entirely to the sales department to expedite the process. Option D. Initiate a comprehensive impact assessment to evaluate the operational, financial, and regulatory consequences of offering the new service. The correct answer is D. Initiate a comprehensive impact assessment to evaluate the operational, financial, and regulatory consequences of offering the new service. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate needs of a client with the long-term implications of a business decision, all while adhering to regulatory requirements. The pressure to deliver a quick solution for a key client could lead to overlooking potential negative impacts on other stakeholders or the company's broader operational integrity. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the chosen approach is not only client satisfactory, but also compliant and sustainable. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves conducting a thorough impact assessment. This aligns with best professional practice and regulatory expectations by ensuring that all potential consequences of a proposed change are identified, analyzed, and mitigated. For Barrett Business Services, this would involve understanding how a new service offering might affect existing client contracts, operational capacity, staffing levels, and compliance with labor laws. A structured impact assessment demonstrates due diligence, proactive risk management, and a commitment to responsible business operations, which are implicitly or explicitly required by the regulatory framework governing employment services. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to immediately implement the new service without any prior evaluation. This fails to meet the professional obligation to assess potential risks and impacts. It could lead to regulatory breaches if the new service inadvertently violates labor laws, contract terms with other clients, or internal operational policies. Ethically, it prioritizes short-term client satisfaction over the well-being of employees and the stability of the business. Another incorrect approach would be to delegate the decision solely to the sales team without involving operational or compliance departments. This bypasses critical expertise and oversight. The sales team's focus on revenue generation might overlook operational feasibility or regulatory compliance, leading to commitments that cannot be met or that expose the company to legal liabilities. This approach demonstrates a failure in internal controls and a disregard for the integrated nature of business operations and regulatory adherence. A third incorrect approach would be to conduct a superficial review, focusing only on the immediate client's stated needs. This lacks the depth required for a comprehensive impact assessment. It fails to consider indirect effects, such as the strain on existing resources, the potential for service degradation for other clients, or the need for new training and compliance protocols. Such a limited review is insufficient to satisfy the professional duty of care and the implicit requirements of operating within a regulated industry. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic decision-making process that begins with understanding the request and its context. This is followed by identifying all relevant stakeholders and potential impacts. The next step involves gathering information and expertise from relevant departments, e.g., operations, legal, compliance. A formal assessment of risks and benefits, considering both short-term and long-term consequences, should then be conducted. Finally, a decision should be made based on the assessment, ensuring alignment with regulatory requirements, ethical principles, and the company's strategic objectives. This structured approach ensures that decisions are informed, responsible, and defensible. Question 9. Strategic planning requires a thorough understanding of potential consequences. When considering a significant operational change aimed at improving efficiency, what is the most prudent initial step to ensure the long-term viability and ethical standing of the business? Option A. Seek input only from the department directly responsible for the operational change. Option B. Rely on historical data from similar past initiatives to predict outcomes. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment across all relevant business functions and stakeholder groups. Option D. Immediately implement the proposed changes to capitalize on anticipated cost savings. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive impact assessment across all relevant business functions and stakeholder groups. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need for operational efficiency with the long-term implications of strategic decisions, particularly concerning the impact on employees and the company's reputation. The core of the challenge lies in anticipating and mitigating potential negative consequences that might not be immediately apparent. Careful judgment is required to ensure that cost-saving measures do not inadvertently lead to greater expenses down the line through increased turnover, decreased morale, or regulatory noncompliance. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive impact assessment. This involves systematically identifying potential effects on all relevant stakeholders, including employees, customers, and the business itself, by considering a broad range of impacts, from operational disruptions and employee morale to potential legal or reputational damage. The company can proactively develop mitigation strategies. This aligns with ethical business conduct and responsible management, which are implicitly expected within any regulatory framework governing business operations, even if not explicitly detailed in a specific hiring assessment test syllabus. A thorough assessment allows for informed decision-making, ensuring that strategic plans are not only financially sound in the short term, but also sustainable and responsible in the long term, thereby minimizing risks and fostering a positive organizational culture. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate cost reduction without considering broader impacts fails to meet professional standards. This could lead to significant regulatory or ethical failures. For instance, if the cost-saving measure involves reducing employee benefits or training without proper consultation or consideration of legal requirements, e.g., employment law regarding changes to terms and conditions, it could result in legal challenges and penalties. Ethically, it demonstrates a disregard for employee well-being, potentially damaging morale and leading to increased staff turnover, which incurs recruitment and training costs that negate the initial savings. Another incorrect approach might be to proceed with a plan based on incomplete or biased information, such as relying only on anecdotal evidence or the opinions of a single department. This can lead to unforeseen negative consequences that could have been identified through a more robust assessment process, potentially violating principles of due diligence and responsible corporate governance. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach to impact assessment. This begins with clearly defining the strategic objective. Next, identify all potential stakeholders and the areas of the business that will be affected. Then, brainstorm and document all possible positive and negative impacts, considering short-term and long-term consequences. This should include operational, financial, human resources, legal, and reputational aspects. Crucially, involve relevant stakeholders in the assessment process to gather diverse perspectives and ensure a more accurate understanding of potential impacts. Finally, use the findings of the impact assessment to refine the strategic plan. Develop mitigation strategies for negative impacts and create contingency plans. This iterative process ensures that decisions are well-informed, responsible, and aligned with both business objectives and ethical considerations. Question 10. The audit findings indicate a potential for increased regulatory scrutiny due to a perceived lack of robust data privacy controls in a recently launched customer onboarding process. While the findings highlight areas of concern, they do not definitively confirm a breach or noncompliance. What is the most appropriate immediate next step for the business to take? Option A. Publicly announce a proactive investigation into the audit findings and implement broad, sweeping changes to all customer-facing processes to demonstrate a commitment to data privacy. Option B. Initiate a comprehensive review of the data privacy controls within the customer onboarding process, engaging relevant stakeholders and seeking expert consultation to validate the audit observations and identify specific remediation actions. Option C. Immediately halt the customer onboarding process and implement a complete overhaul of the system to ensure full compliance with all data privacy regulations, regardless of the definitive nature of the audit findings. Option D. Acknowledge the audit findings internally, but take no immediate action, assuming the concerns are minor and will be addressed through routine operational adjustments over time. The correct answer is B. Initiate a comprehensive review of the data privacy controls within the customer onboarding process, engaging relevant stakeholders and seeking expert consultation to validate the audit observations and identify specific remediation actions. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because the audit findings, while identifying potential risks, are not definitive proof of wrongdoing. The challenge lies in balancing the need for proactive risk management and compliance with the potential for overreaction or misinterpretation of audit observations. A hasty or overly aggressive response could damage business relationships, incur unnecessary costs, or even lead to regulatory scrutiny if not properly justified. Careful judgment is required to assess the severity and likelihood of the identified risks. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, evidence-based assessment before implementing significant changes. This aligns with the principles of sound governance and risk management, which emphasize a proportionate response to identified issues. By seeking clarification and further information, the organization demonstrates a commitment to understanding the root cause of the audit findings and developing targeted, effective solutions. This methodical approach minimizes the risk of unintended consequences and ensures that resources are allocated efficiently to address genuine vulnerabilities. It also reflects a commitment to transparency and due diligence, which are often implicit or explicit requirements in regulatory frameworks governing business operations. An incorrect approach that involves immediate, drastic operational changes without further investigation fails to adhere to principles of proportionality and due process. This could lead to unnecessary disruption and cost, potentially violating internal policies or even external regulations that require a reasoned and justified basis for significant business decisions. Another incorrect approach, such as dismissing the audit findings outright without proper consideration, represents a failure in risk oversight and could expose the organization to significant compliance breaches or operational failures. This demonstrates a disregard for the audit function and a lack of commitment to continuous improvement, which can have severe regulatory and ethical implications, including potential penalties for non-compliance with industry standards or legal obligations. A third incorrect approach, focusing solely on superficial fixes without addressing underlying systemic issues, is also professionally unacceptable as it fails to achieve genuine risk mitigation and can lead to recurring problems, indicating a lack of substantive due diligence and potentially violating regulatory expectations for effective internal controls. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the audit findings and their potential implications. This involves gathering all relevant information, consulting with subject matter experts, and assessing the likelihood and impact of the identified risks. The next step is to evaluate potential mitigation strategies, considering their effectiveness, cost, and feasibility. A proportionate response, based on a thorough risk assessment, should then be developed and implemented. Continuous monitoring and review are essential to ensure that the chosen approach is effective and to adapt as circumstances change. This systematic process ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and aligned with regulatory and ethical obligations. Question 11. Consider a scenario where a candidate preparing for the Barrett Business Services hiring assessment test expresses concern that their genuine experiences might not align perfectly with the ideal responses they've researched online. They ask if you can help them reframe their answers to sound more impressive and better match what they believe the assessors are looking for, even if it means slightly embellishing or omitting certain details. How should you advise this candidate? Option A. Advise the candidate to avoid answering questions where their experience doesn't perfectly match the perceived ideal, as it's better to leave certain aspects unaddressed than to risk providing an imperfect answer. Option B. Suggest that the candidate focus on general positive attributes like enthusiasm and a willingness to learn, as these are universally valued and will likely compensate for any perceived gaps in specific experience. Option C. Explain that the assessment is designed to evaluate specific competencies and that providing honest, accurate responses based on their actual experiences is crucial for a fair evaluation. Advise them to focus on clearly articulating their relevant skills and achievements, even if the presentation isn't perfectly polished, as misrepresentation or embellishment can lead to disqualification or negative consequences. Option D. Agree to help the candidate craft responses that are more likely to impress the assessors, focusing on commonly praised keywords and phrases found in sample answers, even if these do not directly reflect the candidate's personal experiences. The correct answer is C. Explain that the assessment is designed to evaluate specific competencies and that providing honest, accurate responses based on their actual experiences is crucial for a fair evaluation. Advise them to focus on clearly articulating their relevant skills and achievements, even if the presentation isn't perfectly polished, as misrepresentation or embellishment can lead to disqualification or negative consequences. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's desire for a specific outcome and the advisor's obligation to provide objective, compliant advice. The advisor must navigate the client's potentially misinformed enthusiasm with the strict requirements of the Barrett Business Services hiring assessment tests regulatory framework. Failure to do so could result in misrepresentation, regulatory breaches, and damage to both the client relationship and the advisor's professional standing. Careful judgment is required to balance client satisfaction with adherence to the assessment's specific guidelines. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves directly addressing the client's misunderstanding by referencing the specific limitations and requirements of the Barrett Business Services hiring assessment test. This demonstrates professional integrity and a commitment to regulatory compliance. By explaining that the assessment is designed to evaluate specific skills and knowledge relevant to the role, and that attempting to game the system or introduce irrelevant information would be counterproductive and potentially violate assessment integrity rules, the advisor upholds best professional practice. This aligns with the ethical duty to provide accurate and honest guidance, ensuring the client understands the assessment's purpose and the consequences of noncompliance. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves agreeing to the client's request to tailor responses to impress the assessors without regard for the assessment's actual evaluation criteria. This is a regulatory failure because it implies an attempt to manipulate the assessment process, potentially violating rules against misrepresentation or providing misleading information. Ethically, it breaches the duty of honesty and objectivity. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's concerns entirely and refuse to offer any guidance without explaining the rationale. While avoiding misrepresentation, this fails to meet the professional obligation to guide and educate the client within the bounds of compliance. It can lead to client dissatisfaction and a perception of unhelpfulness without addressing the underlying misunderstanding. A third incorrect approach is to suggest focusing on generic soft skills that are not explicitly assessed by the Barrett Business Services hiring assessment test, hoping they will be perceived favorably. This is a failure because it deviates from the assessment's intended scope and may lead the client to invest time and effort in irrelevant areas, ultimately hindering their performance on the actual evaluation. It also risks misrepresenting the assessment's purpose. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the specific requirements of any assessment or regulatory framework. This involves active listening to the client's needs, followed by a clear and direct explanation of the relevant rules, guidelines, and assessment objectives. When faced with a request that appears to conflict with these requirements, the professional should explain the potential negative consequences of noncompliance and offer alternative compliance strategies. The goal is to educate the client and guide them towards a successful outcome that is achieved through legitimate means, thereby protecting both the client and the professional's integrity. Question 12. The investigation demonstrates that a key employee of a major client of Barrett Business Services, BBS, has approached a BBS representative, expressing concerns about their employer's practices and offering to provide internal documentation. This employee is not a direct contact for BBS, and their role within the client organization is not directly related to the services BBS provides. BBS must determine the most appropriate and compliant course of action. Which of the following represents the most professionally sound and ethically responsible approach for BBS? Option A. Immediately cease all communication with the client's employee and inform the client's primary point of contact at BBS about the unsolicited approach, requesting guidance on how to proceed. Option B. Directly engage with the client's employee to gather more information about their concerns and the documentation they are willing to provide, without initially informing the client. Option C. Forward the client's employee's contact information to BBS's legal department for them to handle the situation independently without client notification. Option D. Accept the documentation from the client's employee, review it internally to assess its relevance, and then decide whether to inform the client. The correct answer is A. Immediately cease all communication with the client's employee and inform the client's primary point of contact at BBS about the unsolicited approach, requesting guidance on how to proceed. Explanation: the investigation demonstrates a scenario where a business service provider, Barrett Business Services, BBS, is faced with a potential conflict of interest involving a client's employee. The challenge lies in balancing the need to protect BBS's interests and uphold its professional integrity against the client's expectations and the employee's role. A key aspect of this challenge is navigating the ethical and regulatory landscape concerning client confidentiality, data security, and the proper handling of sensitive information when an employee of the client is also a potential source of information or a party to a dispute. Professional judgment is required to determine the appropriate course of action that aligns with BBS's obligations to its client and its own operational standards. The correct approach involves a structured, transparent, and compliant response that prioritizes the client's interests and adheres to established protocols. This approach represents best professional practice because it demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct, regulatory compliance, and client trust. Specifically, it involves immediate internal consultation with BBS's legal and compliance departments to assess the situation against relevant regulations and internal policies. This ensures that any subsequent actions are legally sound and ethically defensible. The process then moves to a transparent communication with the client, informing them of the situation and BBS's proposed course of action, seeking their guidance and consent where appropriate. This upholds the principle of client primacy and fosters a collaborative resolution. An incorrect approach would be to directly engage with the client's employee without prior consultation or notification to the client. This could lead to regulatory breaches related to data privacy and client confidentiality, potentially violating agreements between BBS and its client. It also creates an ethical hazard by circumventing the established client relationship and potentially creating a perception of impropriety or unauthorized information gathering. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the situation or delay a response, which could be interpreted as negligence or a failure to act in the client's best interest, potentially exposing BBS to liability and reputational damage. Furthermore, attempting to resolve the issue unilaterally without involving BBS's internal compliance and legal teams risks misinterpreting regulations or company policy, leading to non-compliance. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic evaluation of the facts, identification of potential conflicts and risks, consultation with internal experts, legal, compliance, transparent communication with the client, and adherence to all applicable regulations and ethical guidelines. This framework ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and aligned with professional standards. Question 13. Upon reviewing a client's proposed business strategy, you identify a component that, while seemingly beneficial to the client's immediate financial goals, appears to skirt the edges of regulatory disclosure requirements. The client is eager to proceed, emphasizing the competitive advantage this strategy offers. Your role is to advise on the best course of action, ensuring compliance with all relevant business and financial regulations. Option A. Inform the client that their proposed strategy is non-compliant and refuse to provide any further assistance on this matter. Option B. Proceed with the client's proposed strategy, but only after obtaining a written waiver from the client acknowledging their understanding of the potential regulatory consequences. Option C. Advise the client on the potential regulatory risks and ethical concerns associated with the proposed disclosure strategy, and work collaboratively to develop an alternative approach that achieves their objectives while ensuring full compliance. Option D. Immediately implement the client's proposed strategy as requested, assuming the client is aware of and accepts any potential risks. The correct answer is C. Advise the client on the potential regulatory risks and ethical concerns associated with the proposed disclosure strategy, and work collaboratively to develop an alternative approach that achieves their objectives while ensuring full compliance. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated wishes and the potential for those wishes to lead to regulatory noncompliance or ethical breaches. The need for careful judgment arises from the obligation to serve the client's interest while upholding professional standards and legal requirements. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough understanding of the client's objectives and then seeks to align those objectives with applicable regulations and ethical guidelines. This involves open communication, education, and a collaborative effort to find compliant solutions. It demonstrates a commitment to acting with integrity and competence, ensuring that advice provided is both legally sound and ethically responsible. This aligns with the principles of professional conduct that require advisors to act in the best interests of their clients, but not at the expense of legal or ethical obligations. An incorrect approach that involves immediately acceding to the client's potentially problematic request without further inquiry or consideration of regulatory implications fails to meet the standard of professional care. This could lead to regulatory penalties, reputational damage for both the client and the advisor, and a breach of fiduciary duties. Another incorrect approach, that of outright refusal without attempting to understand the underlying need or explore alternatives, can damage the client relationship and may not be the most constructive path to a compliant outcome. It suggests a lack of problem-solving skills and a failure to engage in the consultative process expected of a professional advisor. A third incorrect approach, that of providing advice that is technically correct but fails to consider the broader ethical implications or the spirit of the regulations, can also be problematic. While not directly violating a specific rule, it can lead to outcomes that are technically compliant but ethically questionable, undermining trust and the integrity of the professional's role. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with active listening to fully comprehend the client's situation and goals. This is followed by a comprehensive assessment of the relevant regulatory landscape and ethical considerations. If a conflict arises, the next step is to engage in a dialogue with the client, explaining the regulatory or ethical constraints and collaboratively exploring alternative compliance strategies. The ultimate goal is to achieve the client's objectives in a manner that is both legal and ethical. Question 14. The risk matrix shows a high probability of a client requesting an investment product that, while offering potentially high returns, carries a significant risk of capital loss and is not aligned with their stated conservative risk tolerance and short-term liquidity needs. The client, however, is insistent on proceeding with this specific product due to perceived market trends. As a financial advisor operating under the Barrett Business Services Hiring Assessment Tests regulatory framework, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Suggest a small allocation to the risky product to appease the client, while the majority of their portfolio remains in conservative investments, without a detailed explanation of the specific regulatory concerns regarding the risky allocation. Option B. Decline the client's request and explain that the product is unsuitable based on their financial profile and risk tolerance, offering alternative, more appropriate investment options that align with their stated objectives and regulatory guidelines. Option C. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, documenting their insistence to maintain client satisfaction and avoid potential complaints about not fulfilling their wishes. Option D. Advise the client that while the product is risky, they can proceed if they sign a waiver acknowledging the risks, thereby shifting the responsibility for the investment outcome entirely to the client. Correct answer is C. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, documenting their insistence to maintain client satisfaction and avoid potential complaints about not fulfilling their wishes. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the regulatory requirements designed to protect their financial well-being. The advisor must navigate this tension by prioritizing compliance and client suitability over immediate client satisfaction, which could lead to detrimental outcomes. Careful judgment is required to balance client autonomy with the fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it adheres strictly to the regulatory framework governing financial advice, specifically the principles of Know Your Customer (KIC) and suitability. By conducting a thorough review of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives, the advisor ensures that any recommended product aligns with the client's actual needs and capacity, not just their expressed desire. This proactive stance prevents potential regulatory breaches related to mis-selling or unsuitable investments, thereby safeguarding both the client and the advisor's firm from penalties and reputational damage. This aligns with the core ethical obligation to place the client's interests above all else. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on fulfilling the client's immediate request without due diligence fails to uphold the regulatory obligation to assess suitability. This could lead to the client investing in a product that is too risky, too illiquid, or otherwise inappropriate for their circumstances, potentially resulting in significant financial loss. Such an action would constitute a breach of fiduciary duty and could violate specific regulations requiring advisors to act with integrity and in the client's best interest. Another incorrect approach, which involves attempting to subtly steer the client towards a more suitable option without explicitly explaining the regulatory concerns, is also professionally unacceptable. While seemingly trying to appease the client, this method lacks transparency and can be perceived as manipulative. It fails to educate the client about the risks and benefits of different investment choices, undermining their ability to make informed decisions. This indirect approach can still lead to a mis-selling scenario if the client ultimately proceeds with an unsuitable investment, and it erodes trust by not being forthright about the advisor's professional obligations and concerns. The professional reasoning process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Identify the client's stated objective. 2. Cross-reference this objective with all applicable regulatory requirements and internal firm policies, particularly those related to client suitability and risk assessment. 3. Conduct a comprehensive assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, investment experience, and knowledge. 4. Clearly articulate to the client any discrepancies between their stated objective and what is deemed suitable based on the assessment and regulatory guidelines. 5. Explain the rationale behind the suitability assessment, referencing regulatory principles and potential risks associated with their preferred course of action. 6. Propose alternative suitable investment options that align with the client's objectives and risk profile. 7. Document all discussion, assessments, and recommendations thoroughly. Question 15. Examination of the data shows a pattern of transactions that, while not explicitly illegal on their face, deviate significantly from the client's historical financial behavior and industry norms, raising concerns about potential misrepresentation or undisclosed related party dealings. Barrett Business Services has a contractual obligation to maintain client confidentiality. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the account manager? Option A. Initiate an internal review process, documenting all findings and consulting with Barrett Business Services legal and compliance departments to determine the appropriate next steps based on regulatory requirements and ethical guidelines. Option B. Confront the client directly with the observed discrepancies and demand an explanation. Option C. Immediately report the suspicious transactions to the relevant regulatory authorities, citing the potential for financial impropriety. Option D. Disregard the discrepancies as minor deviations and continue with standard service delivery, assuming the client is acting within their rights. The correct answer is A. Initiate an internal review process, documenting all findings and consulting with Barrett Business Services legal and compliance departments to determine the appropriate next steps based on regulatory requirements and ethical guidelines. Explanation. This scenario presents a challenge in balancing client confidentiality with the potential need to disclose information that could prevent harm. The core of the professional dilemma lies in interpreting the scope of confidential information and the circumstances under which disclosure is permissible or even mandated by professional standards and regulatory guidelines relevant to Barrett Business Services. The data suggests a potential for financial impropriety, which could have significant legal and ethical ramifications for both the client and the service provider. Careful judgment is required to navigate these competing obligations. The correct approach involves a thorough internal review and consultation process before any external disclosure. This aligns with best professional practice by prioritizing due diligence and adherence to established protocols. Specifically, It involves gathering all relevant facts, consulting with internal legal counsel or compliance officers, and assessing the materiality and certainty of the potential impropriety. This methodical process ensures that any disclosure is made only after a reasoned determination that it is necessary and justified, minimizing the risk of unfounded accusations or breaches of confidentiality. It also allows for the exploration of remedial actions within the client relationship if appropriate and feasible. This approach is ethically sound as it respects confidentiality, while also upholding a duty to act with integrity and prevent potential harm or regulatory violations. An incorrect approach would be to immediately disclose the information to external authorities without internal investigation or consultation. This would likely constitute a breach of confidentiality obligations owed to the client, potentially violating contractual agreements and professional ethics. It bypasses the necessary due diligence and could lead to premature or inaccurate accusations, damaging the client's reputation and potentially exposing Barrett Business Services to legal repercussions for wrongful disclosure. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the red flags and take no action. This failure to act would be a dereliction of professional duty. It could expose Barrett Business Services to liability if the impropriety is later discovered, and it is found that they had knowledge or reason to suspect it. Ethically, it undermines the principle of acting with integrity and could contribute to a broader pattern of misconduct. A third incorrect approach would be to confront the client directly with accusations without a clear understanding of the facts or legal basis for such accusations. While direct communication can be valuable, doing so without proper investigation and consultation could escalate the situation unnecessarily, damage the professional relationship, and potentially alert the client to an impending investigation, allowing them to conceal or destroy evidence. This lacks the structured, evidence-based approach required for such sensitive matters. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment. First, identify the potential issue and its implications. Second, gather all available facts and evidence. Third, consult internal policies, legal counsel, and compliance departments to understand regulatory obligations and ethical considerations. Fourth, assess the severity and likelihood of the potential harm or violation. Fifth, determine the most appropriate course of action, which may include further investigation, internal reporting, or, if necessary, external disclosure, always in consultation with legal and compliance experts. Question 16. Performance analysis shows that a particular sector is experiencing significant growth, and a new investment product within this sector has been launched with projections of substantial returns. A client, who has previously expressed a desire for capital preservation and has a low tolerance for risk, is seeking advice on how to invest a portion of their savings. The client has also mentioned a desire to avoid volatile investments. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory requirements and professional ethical standards for advising this client? Option A. Recommend the new high-growth investment product, assuming that the client's desire for capital preservation was a general statement and that they would be willing to take on more risk for the potential of higher returns, given the current market trend. Option B. Advise the client that their stated objectives of capital preservation and low risk tolerance are incompatible with the current market opportunities for high growth, and suggest they reconsider their investment goals. Option C. Research and present investment options that align with the client's stated objectives of capital preservation and low risk tolerance, even if these options do not offer the same high growth potential as the new product. Option D. Recommend the new high growth investment product, emphasizing its potential for substantial returns and explaining that market volatility is a necessary component of achieving such growth. The correct answer is D. Recommend the new high-growth investment product, emphasizing its potential for substantial returns and explaining that market volatility is a necessary component of achieving such growth. Explanation. This scenario presents a challenge in balancing client needs with regulatory compliance, a common issue in financial advisory. The core difficulty lies in interpreting and applying the suitability standard, which requires advisors to recommend investments that are appropriate for clients' financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance. Misinterpreting or overlooking any of these factors can lead to recommendations that, while potentially profitable, are not in the client's best interest and violate regulatory mandates. The correct approach demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing the client's stated objectives and risk tolerance above all else. This aligns with the fundamental fiduciary duty owed to clients, which is reinforced by regulatory frameworks designed to protect investors. Specifically, it adheres to the principle that recommendations must be tailored to the individual, not based on generalized assumptions or the advisor's personal preferences. This proactive engagement with the client to clarify their needs before making recommendations is a cornerstone of ethical and compliant advisory. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the potential for high returns without adequately considering the client's risk tolerance or stated objectives fails to meet the suitability standard. This represents a regulatory failure because it prioritizes potential advisor compensation or a perceived market opportunity over the client's financial well-being. Another incorrect approach that relies on broad generalizations about client demographics rather than individual circumstances is also a regulatory and ethical failure. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the personalized nature of financial advice. Recommending an investment solely because it is popular or has performed well recently, without linking it to the client's specific situation, is a failure to conduct proper due diligence and a potential violation of the duty of care. Professionals should employ a decision-making process that begins with a thorough understanding of the client's financial profile, including their investment objectives, time horizon, risk tolerance, and any specific constraints or preferences. This should be followed by a diligent research process to identify suitable investment options. Crucially, any recommendation must be clearly explained to the client, with a focus on how it aligns with their individual circumstances and the associated risks. Regular reviews and ongoing communication are also vital to ensure that recommendations remain suitable as the client's situation evolves. Question 17. Operational review demonstrates that Barrett Business Services has received several large advance payments from clients for services scheduled to be delivered over the next fiscal year. The accounting team is preparing the current period's financial statements and is considering how to classify these advance payments. What is the most appropriate accounting treatment for these advance payments under U.S. Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, GAAP? Option A. Defer recognition of the advance payments until the entire service contract is fully completed and delivered. Option B. Recognize revenue only for the portion of services that have been verbally confirmed as completed by the client. Option C. Recognize the full amount as revenue in the current period as the cash has been received. Option D. Classify the full amount as unearned revenue, a liability, and recognize it as revenue over the periods in which the services are performed. The correct answer is C. Recognize the full amount as revenue in the current period as the cash has been received. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge related to the accurate and timely reporting of financial information, specifically focusing on the identification and classification of revenue. The difficulty lies in distinguishing between earned revenue and unearned revenue, or deferred revenue, under accrual accounting principles. Misclassifying revenue can lead to material misstatements in financial statements, impacting investor confidence, regulatory compliance, and internal decision-making. The pressure to meet reporting deadlines can exacerbate the risk of errors. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of all customer contracts and service agreements to determine when the performance obligations have been satisfied. Under accrual accounting, revenue is recognized when earned, meaning the entity has substantially completed its obligations and transferred control of goods or services to the customer. For services rendered over time, revenue is recognized as the service is performed. For services to be performed in the future, the payment received is classified as unearned revenue, a liability, and recognized as revenue over the period the service is delivered. This aligns with the principles of Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, GAAP, in the United States, which govern financial reporting for most businesses. Specifically, ASC 606, Revenue from Contracts with Customers, provides detailed guidance on the 5-step model for revenue recognition, emphasizing the transfer of control. Adhering to these principles ensures financial statements present a true and fair view of the company's financial performance and position. Incorrect approach is analysis. Recognizing revenue solely based on the date of invoice issuance or payment receipt is a common error. Invoicing does not necessarily mean the service has been rendered or the goods delivered, and payment receipt simply indicates cash inflow, not earned revenue. This approach violates the accrual basis of accounting and the principles of revenue recognition under GAAP, leading to overstatement of revenue in periods before it is earned and understatement in periods when it is earned. Classifying all payments received as revenue immediately, regardless of the timing of service delivery, is another significant failure. This directly contravenes the concept of earned revenue and the matching principle, which requires expenses to be recognized in the same period as the revenues they help generate. This leads to a distorted view of profitability and can mislead stakeholders about the company's true economic performance. Failing to document the basis for revenue classification or relying solely on verbal agreements without supporting documentation creates a lack of audit trail and increases the risk of subjective or erroneous judgments. This can lead to noncompliance with internal controls and external audit requirements, as well as potential regulatory scrutiny for inadequate record keeping. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach to revenue recognition. This involves 1. Identifying the contract with the customer. 2. Identifying the performance obligations in the contract. 3. Determining the transaction price. 4. Allocating the transaction price to the performance obligations. 5. Recognizing revenue when or as the entity satisfies a performance obligation. This structured process, guided by relevant accounting standards like US GAAP, ensures accuracy and compliance. In situations of ambiguity, consulting with accounting experts or senior management and maintaining clear documentation of the rationale behind revenue classification decisions are crucial steps in professional judgment. Question 18. Analysis of a client's request to invest a significant portion of their portfolio in a highly speculative, illiquid asset class, despite their stated moderate risk tolerance and limited investment experience, requires careful consideration of professional obligations. The advisor has identified several alternative investments that align better with the client's stated risk profile and financial goals, but the client is insistent on pursuing the speculative asset. Which of the following represents the most appropriate professional course of action for the advisor? Option A. Persuade the client to abandon the speculative investment and invest solely in the advisor's preferred, lower-risk options, emphasizing that this is the only responsible path forward. Option B. Politely decline to manage the client's funds if they persist with the speculative investment, as it falls outside the advisor's acceptable risk parameters and could expose the advisor to undue liability. Option C. Immediately execute the client's request to invest in the speculative asset, as the client's instructions are paramount, and override any concerns about suitability or risk. Option D. Thoroughly explain the risks and potential downsides of the speculative investment. Present the alternative, more suitable options with clear justifications, and then proceed with the client's chosen course of action if they remain insistent after being fully informed, ensuring all discussions and decisions are meticulously documented. The correct answer is D. Thoroughly explain the risks and potential downsides of the speculative investment. Present the alternative, more suitable options with clear justifications, and then proceed with the client's chosen course of action if they remain insistent after being fully informed, ensuring all discussions and decisions are meticulously documented. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the fiduciary duty of an advisor to act in the client's best interest, particularly when that preference may lead to suboptimal outcomes or regulatory noncompliance. The advisor must navigate this delicate balance, ensuring transparency and adherence to all applicable regulations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes the client's long-term financial well-being and regulatory adherence. By thoroughly explaining the risks and benefits of the proposed investment strategy, and then recommending a course of action aligned with the client's stated goals and risk tolerance, the advisor fulfills their fiduciary duty. This involves demonstrating a clear understanding of the client's objectives, providing objective advice, and documenting all discussions and decisions. This aligns with the principles of suitability and client care mandated by regulatory bodies overseeing financial services. An incorrect approach that solely follows the client's potentially ill-informed directive without further due diligence or explanation would represent a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could be construed as a breach of the duty of care, as the advisor would be facilitating a decision that may not be in the client's best interest. Furthermore, if the client's directive leads to investments that are unsuitable given their financial situation or risk profile, it could violate suitability rules. Another incorrect approach, which involves pressuring the client to accept the advisor's preferred strategy without fully exploring the client's rationale or concerns, would be a violation of ethical principles related to client autonomy and respect. It also fails to build trust and could lead to a breakdown in the advisor-client relationship. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, fully understand the client's objectives, risk tolerance, and financial situation. Second, educate the client on the potential implications of their stated preferences, including any associated risks, costs, and regulatory considerations. Third, present a range of suitable options, clearly articulating the pros and cons of each. Fourth, make a recommendation based on the client's best interests, supported by objective analysis. Finally, document all advice, discussions, and the client's ultimate decisions thoroughly. Question 19. Cost-benefit analysis shows that implementing a new, less expensive software system for client onboarding could significantly reduce operational expenses. However, this new system has not been explicitly vetted for compliance with all current data privacy regulations applicable to Barrett Business Services operations. What is the most professionally responsible course of action? Option A. Implement the new software system immediately to capture cost savings and inform clients that their data privacy is a secondary concern to operational efficiency. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of the new software system's features and data handling protocols against all relevant data privacy regulations before implementation, and consult with legal counsel if necessary. Option C. Delay the implementation of the new software system indefinitely due to the potential for unforeseen regulatory complications, even if it means continuing with more expensive existing systems. Option D. Proceed with the new software system, assuming it meets all regulatory requirements, and address any potential compliance issues that may arise later. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the new software system, assuming it meets all regulatory requirements, and address any potential compliance issues that may arise later. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate financial benefits of a proposed operational change against potential long-term risks and compliance obligations. The core of the challenge lies in accurately assessing the cost-benefit of a decision that has implications beyond simple monetary gains or losses, touching upon regulatory adherence and client trust. Careful judgment is required to ensure that short-term gains do not lead to significant regulatory penalties or reputational damage. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive risk assessment that explicitly incorporates regulatory compliance as a critical factor, not merely a secondary consideration. This aligns with the principles of responsible business conduct and the duty to operate within the bounds of applicable laws and guidelines. By proactively identifying and mitigating regulatory risks, the business demonstrates a commitment to ethical operations and sustainable growth, thereby safeguarding its reputation and avoiding potential legal repercussions. This proactive stance is a cornerstone of sound business management and regulatory stewardship. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on immediate cost savings without a thorough regulatory impact assessment fails to meet professional standards. This oversight can lead to significant regulatory violations, resulting in fines, sanctions, and reputational damage. Such an approach demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the legal framework governing business operations. Another incorrect approach that delegates the regulatory assessment to an unqualified individual or department is also professionally unacceptable. This abdication of responsibility can result in misinterpretations of complex regulations, leading to non-compliance and potential legal liabilities. It undermines the principle of accountability and the importance of expert knowledge in navigating regulatory landscapes. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured framework that begins with clearly defining the proposed change and its objectives. This should be followed by a multifaceted assessment that includes financial, operational, and, crucially, regulatory impacts. Engaging relevant internal stakeholders, including legal and compliance departments, is essential. If external expertise is required, it should be sought from qualified professionals. The decision should then be made based on a holistic evaluation of all identified risks and benefits, with a clear preference for approaches that ensure compliance and ethical conduct, even if they involve higher initial costs. This systematic approach ensures that decisions are informed, defensible, and aligned with long-term business sustainability and integrity. Question 20. Process analysis reveals that Barrett Business Services is utilizing a long-standing, internally developed assessment for entry-level positions. While this assessment has been in use for over a decade, recent feedback from some candidates and a review of industry best practices suggest potential concerns regarding its continued relevance and fairness. The company is seeking guidance on how to proceed with evaluating and potentially updating this assessment to ensure ongoing compliance with the Barrett Business Services Hiring Assessment Tests regulatory framework. Option A. Continue using the existing assessment without modification, assuming its historical use implies continued compliance and effectiveness. Option B. Immediately discontinue the use of the existing assessment and implement a new, externally sourced assessment without a formal validation process, prioritizing speed of implementation. Option C. Rely on anecdotal feedback from a small group of recent hires and hiring managers to make minor adjustments to the existing assessment scoring. Option D. Conduct a thorough validation study of the existing assessment to determine its current job relatedness and predictive validity, and if necessary, revise or replace it based on the findings. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough validation study of the existing assessment to determine its current job relatedness and predictive validity, and if necessary, revise or replace it based on the findings. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in business operations, where a company must balance the need for efficient service delivery with the imperative to comply with regulatory requirements. The professional challenge lies in interpreting and applying the specific provisions of the Barrett Business Services Hiring Assessment Tests governing regulations to a novel situation, ensuring that the company's actions are both legally sound and ethically responsible. Misinterpreting these regulations can lead to significant legal repercussions, reputational damage, and unfair treatment of potential employees. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the Barrett Business Services Hiring Assessment Tests regulatory framework, specifically focusing on the principles of fairness, non-discrimination, and the validity of assessment methods. Best professional practice dictates that any assessment tool or process must be demonstrably job-related and predictive of successful performance. This requires a systematic review of the assessment's design, content, and scoring to ensure it aligns with the actual requirements of the roles being filled. Adherence to these principles is mandated by the spirit and letter of regulations governing hiring practices, which aim to prevent bias and ensure equal opportunity. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach would be to rely solely on anecdotal evidence or the subjective opinions of hiring managers regarding the effectiveness of the assessment. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for objective, validated assessment methods and opens the company to claims of arbitrary or discriminatory hiring practices. Disregards the need for empirical data to support the assessment's validity. Another incorrect approach would be to assume that because an assessment has been used historically, it remains compliant and effective. Regulations often require periodic review and validation of assessment tools to ensure they continue to be relevant and free from bias, especially as job roles evolve. Failing to reevaluate can lead to the use of outdated or discriminatory assessments. A third incorrect approach would be to prioritize speed and cost-effectiveness over regulatory compliance and assessment validity. While efficiency is important, it cannot come at the expense of adhering to legal and ethical standards. Using a quick, inexpensive assessment without proper validation is a direct violation of the principles of fair hiring. Professional reasoning. Professionals should approach this situation by first identifying the specific regulatory framework governing the Barrett Business Services Hiring Assessment Test. They should then conduct a comprehensive review of the assessment's design, content, and scoring against the requirements of the job roles. This involves seeking expert advice if necessary, gathering data on the assessment's predictive validity, and ensuring that the process is free from bias. If the assessment is found to be lacking, the professional should recommend modifications or the adoption of a new, validated assessment tool, always prioritizing compliance and fairness.